This next video focuses on a number of female artists in Europe who had a decent amount of professional success but continued to face certain challenges and struggles. We'll be thinking about artists who were able to enter some of the art academies, sometimes royal art academies, those that were associated with the monarch of a given country or nation, and then also other kind of more local art academies, and then also thinking about women who were regularly exhibiting in the salons, which were these regularly scheduled events where a number of artworks would go on display, and artists were very competitive about where their artwork was displayed. It helped them to earn commissions, and it's also where they could have important sales, and art critics would attend these salons and were often quite harsh about judging the art that was on display. So we'll be talking about that in today's video. On the screen, you see a painting representing one of these art academies, and you can see that there are two women who are part of the academy, but they are not actually in the room. They're just referred to through the images on the wall here. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that was and why were these two women permitted to be in the art academy. But the main idea here is that they're actually in a life drawing classroom where men would be naked, and so women artists were not permitted into that space. So we'll talk a bit more about this particular painting later in the lecture. But I think it's a great illustration of how these art academies were mostly male spaces, but a few women were able to get in after great challenges. All right, starting off with Rosalba Carriera, who was an important artist born in the 17th century but worked into the 18th century and was very, very popular. So she was born in Venice, so she's Italian, but spent a good amount of time in France as well, and was elected to the Académie Royale there in 1720. She was able to work for royalty and aristocracy in France as well. When she was in Venice, she really made her name at first creating miniatures. So she would create these kind of miniature paintings, which were often associated with women, the idea that they're very delicate and small. And so it was something that women could create, especially on little snuff boxes, which were popular at the time. And she would paint on ivory. She then moved on to using pastels, and she was really known as a master of pastel. And so you can see just this wonderful kind of shimmering quality that she was able to get on different textures. And of course, because fashion was so important in places like Venice and then also in France, where she goes later, the importance of fashion and lace. She was trained actually in some lace making, but this tradition was kind of going out of style at this point, so she transitioned to creating paintings rather than lace making. Of course, any kind of needlework was always seen as very appropriate for women. You see her here in the act of painting. You can also see in this next work a very famous painting of the artist Antoine Watteau, who died relatively young. This actually was created the year of his death when he was 36 years old. And Watteau was seen as a master of the Rococo style. And the Rococo was a style that tended to, like the pastel colors that we're seeing here, the kind of emphasis on aristocracy, fashion, themes of love. These were all very common things that we saw in the Rococo style. You can see the way Rosalba Carriera represented him. You can see the kind of soft flowing hair, the intense gaze that we're seeing here, but also this kind of sullen expression. Again, that kind of interest in fashion and the delicacy of certain fabrics and laces. I just wanted to show you a work by Watteau, who you see here. It's called The Embarkation for Cythera, one of his most famous paintings. And you can see again that kind of looseness of the brushwork, the kind of similarities to the soft pastel colors that we see with Rosalba. So it seems that the two of them perhaps learned from each other. In this final work by Rosalba, we see her representing herself as Winter. So it's a self-portrait as Winter. And again, you can see, she's representing herself in winter garb. So she has these kind of velvet materials and this soft fur around her collar and around her head, beautiful pearl earrings, again, creating these kind of iridescent qualities around the painting. So she was incredibly popular and one of the most famous artists at this time in the area of France and in Italy. People really enjoyed her work. However, she really fell out of fashion by the end of the 18th century. So as the style changes to a style called Neoclassicism, and then into the styles of Romanticism and Realism, this kind of Rococo style with its pastel shades falls out of fashion. It's important to note that even though Rosalba Carriera was embraced by France in the early 18th century, there was still a lot of misogynistic thinking. So, for example, the philosopher and writer Rousseau, who is very much associated with the Enlightenment and kind of the expansion of rights, was very anti-women in many ways. So, for example, in Paris, there was a strong what we call salon culture. These places where women would host kind of intellectual gatherings. So this is different from the painting salons that we're going to talk about later in the lecture. So this is more of just kind of meetings that people would have, and they were social, intellectual, but women were really in charge of them. And Rousseau, or they were often in charge, Rousseau said the salon was a prison in which men are subjected to the rule of women. He rejected women as speakers. He thought that female citizenship was monstrous. And he thought about women who left the house, who did other things outside of the house, such as becoming a female artist. He said things like, she despises all the duties of a woman and always begins to play the man. She has left her natural state. Her home is like a lifeless body, which is soon corrupted. So this idea that she's abandoned her duties as a homemaker, and that needlework is really very natural to women, and that's what they should focus on. On that note, we'll move on to thinking about Angelica Kauffmann, who was quite an international artist. She was born in Switzerland, but eventually was one of the founding members elected to the Royal Academy in London. Her work was very much praised. She really embraced this new neoclassical style. She was familiar with, she had been to Italy and had seen antiquities, and so she was able to embed these kind of influences into her work. And here we see her represented in a self-portrait. A painting by Kauffmann that's quite well known is called Zeuxis selecting models for his pictures of Helen of Troy. And so it was said that Zeuxis, this great Greek artist, Greek painter, who we don't have any paintings that are associated with him today, but there's a story that when he was creating his image of Helen of Troy, this woman who was said to be the most beautiful woman in antiquity, that he gathered together different women and examined their bodies to essentially pick out who had the most beautiful arms and who had the most beautiful breasts and who had the most beautiful feet. And he essentially looked at all these women who you see here kind of lined up to figure out how is he going to make this kind of composite of the most beautiful woman. So for example, maybe this woman has the most beautiful back. But here you see him, this is Zeuxis, examining this woman's arms. And this is based on a representation of Venus, the goddess of love. And it's interesting in this painting, however, because even though Zeuxis is doing all his measuring, he has his tool on the floor here, there's a female represented here who many people say looks very similar to Angelica Kauffmann, who seems to be getting ready to paint and who has this large canvas or panel in the background to get started working. So there's kind of these allusions to the importance of females working here. The antiquity that it's based on is called the Venus Calyptos, the Venus of the beautiful buttocks. So I always think that's an interesting name. You can see the hair kind of piled up on her head in a similar way, the kind of falling drapery, and then in this case, the clear exposure of the buttocks, but in this case, it's covered up. So perhaps she's making some adjustments for propriety's sake. So I'd mentioned that she was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy in London, and she contributed, or she was commissioned to create some roundels, some kind of circles decorating the central hall of the Royal Academy. And so here you can see her representation of design. And so design is very key for painting, meaning the underlying design, and also the idea of creating a drawing, kind of an idea of what you're going to create. And so in this particular roundel, you see a woman hard at work, and she's she's looking at a particular torso. This is a very famous torso that's in the collection of the Vatican called the Belvedere torso. So we see that here. So you can see how there's portions of it kind of cut off here. The head is no longer present. But this interest in representing the lines, the design, getting the kind of purity of this type of very important ancient sculpture that Angelica Kauffmann is representing in this scene. You can also see these columns in the background. So you can see these fluted columns emphasizing the importance of line, design, underlying structure. Very significant. But as I said, this was part of a series, and so these were all considered important parts of painting. So design is significant. Color, of course, is significant. You see a figure holding a paintbrush with a rainbow in the background and this lovely jolt of red. The importance of composition, kind of how are elements arranged, and then also invention. How are you bringing something new to the painting? And so invention is significant as well. So kind of all the elements of good painting around this time in the late 18th century. Kauffmann's most famous work is probably this painting called Cornelia Presenting Her Children as Her Treasures. So again, we're moving into that neoclassical style, so kind of this revisiting of antiquity. So we saw that in the representation of Zeuxis, so thinking about a Greek artist. We saw it in the way she represented design, where she has that old Belvedere torso from antiquity. And then we're seeing it here again. We can see, again, a column in the background, a really crisp, clear, kind of space that they're inhabiting, a clear use of perspective. It's not overly ornate like in the Rococo style. And the story here comes from the Roman Republic, where a woman named Cornelia, who had very important children, is showing off her children as her treasures. This one woman is showing off all her jewelry, and Cornelia is responding, you might have material pleasures, but my true joy and my true treasures are my children here. And this exemplified the kind of higher moral ideals that were often portrayed in neoclassical paintings. Okay, so let's jump into the Zoffany painting with a little bit more detail. So I showed this to you at the beginning. You can get the sense of what the Royal Academy in London was like in the late 18th century as it was being founded. And so you can see here Angelica Kauffmann, the woman we were just talking about, and Mary Moser. These were the two women founding members of the Royal Academy. And so the name of this is the Academicians of the Royal Academy. So you see a crowded room of men talking about drawing, talking about creating or representing the male nude. It's more about intellect than the actual drawing, because they all seem more to be chatting than to actually be drawing. This is the president, Joshua Reynolds. He has a little ear horn that he's holding. There's also a Chinese artist who had visited recently. So we see that figure represented over here, just off from the left. And then you can see the two men who are posing. This one's in a pose called the Spinario pose. So it actually references a particular antique sculpture that was very commonly drawn and used. You can also see models in the background that are often found in these types of art academies, which would be used for sketching and for other artistic inspiration. But the key idea here is that women could not come to these types of classes. They could not come to a life drawing class. They could not see the male nude. And so many art historians, most famously an art historian named Linda Nochlin, has argued that the fact that women did not have access to the nude greatly restricted their ability to succeed and to become great artists. Because really you needed that access to the nude in order to be a great artist around this time. So they are kind of paying, or Zoffany is paying respects to Kauffmann and to Moser by including them in the image, but it's obvious that they can't actually participate fully because they can't access this particular nude drawing class. So that's a key difference between the men and women at this time. Even though they were accepted into the academy, they really weren't full members. Women artists continue to be the subject of scorn in many cases as well. For example, there was a sculptor named Anne Seymour Damer, and we'll actually talk more about female sculptors in the next lecture. And so here we see her in this kind of cartoon or satire called the Damerian Apollo, where she's shown carving in her studio in her huge dress, and essentially she's shown kind of inserting it right into the bottom. So this is really mocking her not as a great artist, but as a woman kind of engaged in something that's inappropriate. All right, we're going to move on to Elisabeth-Louise Vigee-Lebrun, who is this very, very important female artist in France in the late 18th century and early 19th century. By the 19th century, she was traveling around quite a bit and trying to avoid the French Revolution. So here we see her in a self-portrait, a very famous self-portrait. You can see in this particular case how French fashion is changing a little bit. It's very loose and very soft. They're kind of moving away from those more structured and binding dresses. It's greatly influenced by Rubens. Once Vigée-Lebrun got married, she did travel to Flanders in the Netherlands, and she was able to see the work of Rubens and was greatly inspired by his use of color. She also liked the work of Van Dyck. So she was inspired by artists outside of France. The kind of shadow on her face, her expression, her gaze at the viewer, the hat that she wears, all of this is closely connected to an example by a very well-known Baroque painter, Peter Paul Rubens. So why is Vigée-Lebrun so famous? Mostly due to her connection to Marie-Antoinette, so the Queen of France, who was famously married to Louis XVI, and who also was eventually killed by the guillotine during the French Revolution. So here we see a painting of Marie-Antoinette, and Vigée-Lebrun was always trying to kind of improve the image of Marie-Antoinette among the French people because they saw her as a foreign queen. They didn't necessarily like many aspects of her. So Vigée-Lebrun was always trying to represent her in a very positive way. This was actually a replacement portrait from a portrait where Marie Antoinette was wearing a kind of a cotton muslin dress, and that was considered so inappropriate for a French queen. And so here she's wearing a much more kind of ornate outfit, but perhaps it wasn't quite up to the French standards. Lebrun was accepted into the Académie Royale in 1783, but not in kind of the highest level categories, which was history was highest and portraiture would be the second highest. Her membership was actually contested because her husband, whose last name was Lebrun, he was an art dealer, and so that was kind of a method for contesting her being accepted. Marie Antoinette, however, helped to ensure her acceptance by kind of lobbying on her behalf through her husband, Louis XVI, the King of France. But her membership was dissolved after the French Revolution. No women were allowed in the Academy after the Revolution. So we often think about political revolutions as ways to give people more power, but in fact, the French Revolution really took away a lot of power from women because women kind of had these informal roles in government. And also, you know, there were ways for them to become parts of these societies. But once the revolution happened, women really were restricted in many more ways than they had been previously. Another very well-known painting of Marie Antoinette by Vigée-Lebrun is this painting, Marie Antoinette with her children. This was another attempt by Lebrun to try to improve Marie Antoinette's kind of the way she was received by the French public. We see her here as deeply maternal. She's holding her son. Her daughter leans on her affectionately. We also see the son, the dauphin, the boy who's going to become the next king, except eventually they're going to be overthrown by the revolution. And the fact that she's recently lost one of her children. So a baby girl had recently died. So you see the young prince opening up the crib to show the viewer the loss of his sister. You can see that they're in the palace of Versailles. So they're in their very large, stately palace. Also, it's supposed to kind of reference that idea of Cornelia showing her children as her treasures, because even though she's in this beautiful stately palace, she actually has a kind of a jewelry chest, a very ornate kind of chest over here that would have held valuable objects. She's saying that kind of material luxury isn't as important to me. My family is really what matters. So you can see the group of them together. You can also see she has a very solemn expression, Marie Antoinette, the idea that she's in a sad point in her life because she has lost one of her children. Many people say this painting also is meant to represent or connect to kind of the way the Holy Family was represented. So to make her look particularly kind of holy and spiritual, or a devoted family woman. You can definitely see that the fashion, it continues to be very important in France. She had these distinct kind of hats with feathers and things like that. So they're definitely trying to show that the royal family is well off, but perhaps not trying to overdo their obsession with material things. Vigée-Lebrun was accepted into the Academy on the same day as Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, who was often called like her main competitor. And I always think this is very interesting because it seems like, you know, you can only have one woman making it to the top, or if there are two women, they have to be fighting each other. And so people seem to make perhaps more of this competition than actually existed. If the competition was in fact very intense, I think that's kind of unfortunate, but this idea that both of them were accepted. Labille-Guiard often worked for some of the family members of Louis XVI, and Vigée-Lebrun was closely associated with Marie Antoinette. So she worked for the Queen, whereas Labille-Guiard worked for like the King's aunt and also for his sisters and things like that. So they seem to be working for kind of different elements of the royal family, but closely associated with female portraits. All right, so here just to see Vigée-Lebrun in a self-portrait. This was seen as especially inappropriate. You can see that she's, you know, like Marie Antoinette being shown here with her child. But in this particular work, you can see that Vigée-Lebrun is smiling. Her mouth is open slightly, which was considered very, very inappropriate. Her daughter's name was Julie, and but she was known kind of as Brunette for her brown hair, I guess. You can see the rich use of colors in these paintings as we compare them, the kind of green texture, the satin in the background, the gold on her lap, but also just this great affection. You can see the kind of more natural affection between Vigée-Lebrun and her daughter versus the more kind of stately associations or stately appearance of Marie Antoinette and her children. So even though this painting wasn't appreciated when it was first created and shown, it was seen as really inappropriate. I think it has aged well because it shows this lovely affection between mother and daughter. And she created a similar one, although with her mouth closed, a few years later, 3 years later. And so you can see again that kind of sweet relationship between mother and daughter. And many times female artists felt like, oh, they couldn't get married or they couldn't have children, or when they did, they had to give up their career. But Vigée-Lebrun is showing kind of that continuation of her career, even though she is a mother, and she's highlighting the fact that she's a mother. Vigée-Lebrun produced something like 600 portraits over the course of her lifetime, so she was extremely prolific. She made a very good living, although apparently her husband spent a lot of it. And also when the revolution happened, she had to leave France with her daughter, and her husband was said to have been forced to divorce her because she was so linked to the royal family. So eventually her husband divorces her. She moves to a variety of locations. She goes through Italy. She eventually ends up in Russia, and she's producing portraits along the way in order to, make her living. Here we just see a portrait of Hubert Robert, who is a painter in France around the time of the Revolution. Just to compare to the most famous work of neoclassical painting, or one of the most famous, this is called The Oath of the Horatii by Jacques-Louis David. And I think this just highlights the kind of gender differences that were seen during the French Revolution. So for example, men were seen as really the people of action during the Revolution. In this particular case, it refers to a story from the Roman Republic again. You can see the kind of classical background, the clarity of the scene, the use of perspective. And it's the story where 3 men take an oath to go fight this kind of other group, the Horatii, even though they have these kind of family relationships between the two. And so just this idea that they're going to go fight with the ideal of state over family, that you should always fight for the state. And so this image really becomes a symbol for the French Revolution later on, even though it was created a few years before the revolution really gets going. But you can see that the men are the ones who are making this oath. The men are the ones who are going to fight for the state. And the women are seen as these kind of weak, weepy beings off to the side. Granted, they were connected to that family, to some of the men who they're about to go fight, so that's why they're particularly sad. But you can just see this kind of difference between the straight lines and the strength of the men and the kind of softness of the women's bodies. This is a painting that's long been kind of contested, very famous painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection in New York, and it was long associated with the artist David, the artist that we just saw here. So many people thought that it was a painting by David of this woman, Marie-Joséphine Charlotte Duval-Donne, and people, were always saying, oh, it's by David because he's this really significant painter. But there's actually some problems with kind of the anatomy. Also, the way light and shadows used is quite different from how David used it. And so now it's been attributed to a female artist named Marie-Denise Villers. And she was a student of a man named Girodet, who tended to use these kind of dark shadows and bright lights and these kind of plays of light that you see being used here. And many people see, although there are some anatomical challenges, there are many exceptional elements here. For example, she shows a broken window and the kind of difference between the smokiness of the window and the clarity of the broken part of the window. You can see a couple in the distance. An art historian has identified this room as a room in the Louvre. So this was an important royal palace that becomes a painting space or a painting gallery, an art gallery in France. And this was a room that a lot of female artists would use and would gather and study. So many people think that this is Marie-Joséphine Charlotte, who's learning how to be an artist, but eventually gives it up when she gets married and has children. And Marie-Denise Villers is representing her. So maybe they're painting each other, or Charlotte is maybe, Marie-Joséphine Charlotte is maybe drawing Marie-Denise, and then she's being painted and exchanged. If this is the painting that the Metropolitan believes that it is, then it was exhibited in the Paris Salon of 1801. But again, it continues to be debated, and it has been for a long time. Moving on to Rosa Bonheur. Rosa Bonheur was a very successful painter. She did exhibit in the Salon. This was debuted in the Paris Salon of 1853, and it was widely praised. It was widely beloved. It's a large painting. It's something like 8 by 16 feet, so it's very, very big. It's really her masterwork, her masterpiece. Rosa Bonheur is known as an animal painter, so she would paint bulls and horses and birds and all kinds of animals. She was very famous for living a more alternative lifestyle at this time. She was known to have a female companion for about 40 years and then another female companion when her original one died. So she was more or less a very public lesbian. She also dressed in male clothing, and so some people thought she was like deliberately trying to take on this male persona, but it may have been because she was just working with animals. She said, like, I need to dress this way because it's practical. So she would often put on pants when it was very rare for this to happen. Some people say she also would wear male clothing because when she went to places like the horse fair in Paris, she didn't want to stand out as a woman. So it was an easy way for her to kind of fit in if she was wearing male clothing. She grew up in a family where her parents, her father believed in educating both men and women, both boys and girls. So there was this great equality in her household, and that probably affected her in terms of how the success she was able to achieve. Thinking about the horse fair, there's a wonderful energy to this work. There's also wonderful brushwork. She's associated with the style of realism, which you often see this kind of grittiness to, and there's this dusty grittiness to the earth here that's being kicked up by the horses. You can see the use of different brushwork in the sky versus the more kind of precise brushwork in the coats of the horses. She has the horses in a variety of poses. Many people say she was influenced by two artists in this particular work, George Stubbs, who often did animal studies, and then Géricault, who often was associated with this more kind of dramatic romanticism, the romantic style, more energy, more drama. She called it her own Parthenon frieze. So the Parthenon frieze, it may represent what's called the Pan-Athenaic procession, this kind of event that would happen in Athens. So the Parthenon is a temple in Athens, and there was a section of sculpture where all of this kind of energy and parading was happening. And she called this her own Parthenon frieze, referring to this great masterpiece from antiquity, because the Parthenon dates to the 5th century BCE. Just to show you one more example of an animal painting done by Rosa Bonheur, this is a wounded eagle. You can see her signature, rather bold right here. Again, that kind of loose brushwork of the sky, and then the more precision on the representation of the animal itself. Okay, finishing up with a few artists from England. So Emily Marie Osborn, here you can see her. She showed this in the Royal Academy in 1857. She's really emphasizing the idea of cities, like big cities such as London, as a man's domain. So you see this kind of cold, dirty, smoggy city where a woman has gone in to show her painting, to show her work. And you can see that the men are judging her. They're saying, like, oh, I'm not that into this. You can also see a man off to the side looking at a painting of a ballerina. The idea here that women are really more objectified as something to look at, something pretty to look at, not as the producers of artwork. So you see this very timid woman as she enters into that space. And here I'm just comparing this work to a painting by the artist Degas. He had many, many paintings of ballet dancers and sculptures of ballet dancers, really reinforcing the idea of women as beautiful objects to behold, whereas Emily Marie Osborn is really trying to see herself as a creator. And so this is from England, and I'm calling it a genre painting, which just means a scene from everyday life. Elizabeth Thompson was a very important artist, also from the 19th century, and she came very, very close to being accepted into the Royal Academy. So after Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser, there weren't any women that got in for a very long time. Elizabeth Thompson came very close, especially through this painting called The Roll Call, or Calling the Roll After an Engagement, Crimea. It was actually purchased by Queen Victoria, and it was a hit. People came from all over to see it in the salon, to see it on display. And it emphasized the heroism and pathos of war. You can see the roll call happening, and you can see a man has collapsed. Men are injured. They look tired and wounded. So war was often glorified as this event that was something where men could go and find a lot of glory. But in this particular occasion, you're really seeing the struggle of that warfare. You're really seeing the challenges. Here we see a self-portrait of Elizabeth Thompson. At this point, there was a Royal Female School of Art, so women had been pushed out of the main Royal Academy and into a female school. And she also spent time in Italy, so she actually traveled to Florence, and these greatly would have influenced her training. And she did get close to getting into the main Royal Academy, but was never actually accepted. To show some of her other works about the struggle of war, this is called Remnants of an Army from 1879. In the First Anglo-Afghan War, it depicts the only, or supposed only survivor, apparently there were a few more, of 16,000 soldiers to retreat from Kabul to Jalalabad. And our last artist is Anna Leah Merritt, who was actually born in America, born in the US, but eventually settled in England. So you can see again those kind of challenges of war, but here shown from a female perspective, the kind of worry on a woman's face as all these men are heading off to war. You can see the kind of bright colors that were popular in painting around this time. Again, the interest in this kind of dramatic and flowing costumes. Here you see representations of Anna Leah Merritt. So born in Philadelphia, she studied anatomy at the Women's Medical College and then trained in Italy and France and eventually settled in England. And a particularly poignant painting that she created called Love Locked Out. She made this in response to the fact that her husband died just 2 months after they were married. So you see the figure of Cupid, the figure representing love, who's trying to break into a mausoleum, a place of burial, basically trying to break down the door. The idea that she's trying to reunite with her beloved. So Cupid, the god of love, is shown here trying to force open the door of the mausoleum. You can see his bow and arrow and lamp have been cast aside. And you see the wonderful kind of warm and rich colors that she uses. But of course, the theme of this in both the paintings we've seen, both in War and in Love Locked Out, very sad, kind of tragic subjects that we're thinking about. Obviously, in War, the women are thinking about how the men are probably, or many of them are probably not coming home and what they're going off to do. And in this case, she's longing to be reunited with her beloved husband. All right, well, I hope this showed some ideas of women succeeding, but also facing some challenges. And we'll continue this discussion in the next video, where we'll especially focus on women as sculptors and moving out of Europe and thinking about some other regions as well.